Chapter 1. You should kill yourself. Inside a dirty alleyway filled with oily pipes, electrical wires, and broken walls, a young man sat on the ground with his back to the wall. His head was lowered as he lifelessly stared at the ground visible between his legs. The sun was positioned in the middle of the sky, perfectly above this boy. Because of that, the alleyway was brightly lit. I know that it comes as a bit of a shock, but I genuinely think the best course of action for you in this situation would be to kill yourself. The boy didn't lift his head as he heard these words at this moment. A dirty and disheveled rat was sitting on top of a small rusty box made of metal. The rat was lightly scratching its snout as it looked with widely opened eyes at the boy, trying to establish eye contact. "Listen," the rat said as it jumped down from the box and slowly walked towards the boy. "We all know what happened. It's not like I'm suggesting suicide without a logical basis. You know?" As the rat came closer, the boy's eyes suddenly gained life, and he looked at the rat with intensity. The rat's eyes widened, and it went on its hind legs as it slowly retreated. "Calm down, Nick. I'm not going to hurt you," it said with a nervous smile as it stopped retreating. "Look at me. I'm just a rat. How am I supposed to hurt someone that managed to get through the Zephyx extractor exam?" The boy, Nick, looked back at the ground. When Nick just lifelessly looked at the ground like that, he looked like a frail, homeless person. But when he just looked at the rat, his entire demeanor changed. In fact, Nick's body was anything but frail. While he wasn't very bulky, his muscles were pretty defined, which wasn't surprising, considering that he had trained for the last 4 years in hopes of finally getting out of the dregs. "Hey, Nick," the rat said, not daring to get any closer. "I know that you're still holding on to some hope, but we both know that believing in this fickle light of hope is just delusional." The rat slowly moved around Nick's body, but it didn't dare to get too close to his body. "Over the last 4 years, you worked so hard on yourself. You trained every day, and you even committed some terrible acts just to avoid paying the blood tax. You didn't want to do these things, but you still did them. Why? Because you saw a way out of the dregs. And you did it. You managed to get a spot in the Zephyx extractor exam for Ghosty's lab, and you even managed to pass it," the rat said with a lot of enthusiasm, and then the rat just sighed. "But your Zephyx synchronizer was already attuned to a Spectre. You managed to pass the exam, but Ghosty's lab can't use a Zephyx extractor with an already synchronized Zephyx synchronizer. And you know that they are not the only ones," the rat said as it stopped on Nick's right side. "No Zephyx manufacturer will hire you like this. You know as well as I that all the companies have specific specters for their extractors. Without the abilities from these specters, you will either die very quickly or will cost the company more money than you bring in." "So, what now?" the rat asked, looking at Nick with a sympathetic expression. "What's the plan now? You don't have an education. You don't have contacts. You don't have a place to live. You don't even remember anything from before you were 10. You can't even join the gangs or any of their businesses since you vehemently refused to pay them their fees. There's no way out. Are you willing to continue living like this?" the rat asked with a sad and pained voice. "I don't want to see you go through so much pain every day. Just stop." The rat was carefully and slowly moving toward Nick. As the rat moved closer to Nick, several pairs of eyes appeared behind the dark sewer grates in the alley. They were watching everything with excitement. Nick just continued looking at the ground. "Don't you just want to rest?" the rat asked as it very carefully moved forward. "Every day, you sleep with one eye open, fearing that something or someone will attack you. You don't even have a single friend or family member. What's the point of fighting? What's the point of living like this? And now, even your last hope is gone." The rat looked with a sympathetic gaze at Nick. "Trust me, I've talked to millions of people, and I know a hopeless situation when I see one. I can make it quick and painless. If you want, I can even pay special attention to some people you dislike. At least, like this, you can go out on your own terms instead of just starving to death. Your death would actually have a purpose." The rat managed to get so close to Nick that it could even touch his leg. The rats behind the sewer grates slowly and carefully stepped out, but they still remained at a great distance. It was important not to induce a fight or flight response in their target. Adrenaline can bring momentary life to the black hole inside the chest of a suffering person. This had to be done methodically, slowly, and carefully. "Just lay down, okay?" the rat said slowly. "I am going to lightly touch your leg now. Don't be afraid, I won't do anything." The rat slowly extended its claw to touch Nick's leg. Bang. A powerful fist hit the rat, turning it into a bloody paste. An instant later, all the other rats fled back into the sewer. Silence. The fist unclenched and took hold of the smashed rat. Then he took out a filthy, old, and disgusting brown sack and put the rat into it. A moment later, Nick straightened his back and took a deep breath. This sucks, he said, his voice a bit deeper than the average man's, but then a small smile formed on his lips as he lifted the dirty brown sack. But at least, dinner is secured. Suddenly, Nick's eyes narrowed as he shot up to his feet. He glared down one of the alleyway's exits. Just now, a muscular man wearing a black coat and black hat had appeared near that exit at this moment. Nick could see a mysterious smirk adorning the man's lips as he looked at Nick with amusement. "What do you want?" Nick asked with a harsh and threatening voice. Nick had seen many people, and he knew that someone that was acting like this wasn't up to anything good. "I don't buy drugs, miracle cures, specters, Zephyx, or whatever you have to sell," Nick said. A moment later, Nick's eyes widened a bit and he put the brown sack behind him. "I'm also not selling you the rat." The man looked slightly taken aback, but he started chuckling in amusement. "Your rat? You think I'm after your rat?" he asked with a smirk. Nick eyed the man suspiciously. "I'm not buying anything. Also, it's rude to enter someone's home unannounced." "Home," the man repeated in confusion as he looked around the alleyway. After looking for a bit, the man saw a small shack made of bits and pieces of discarded and rusty metal. The man took a deep breath and sighed before his black hat vanished, revealing his handsome face. There were a couple of covert wrinkles on the man's forehead, and Nick could also see a couple of individual gray hairs among his usual black hair. The man just chuckled a bit. "You asked me what I wanted?" he repeated. "Well, you could call me a scholar," the man said with a smile as he looked at Nick. "I study specters, more specifically, the power specters can bestow to humans." "I said I'm not buying anything," Nick shouted. The man took another deep breath and released a sigh. "I am a consultant to many Zephyx manufacturers, and Ghosty's lab is one of them," the man said as he slowly lifted his right index finger. The next moment, a ball of bloody tools made of metal materialized above his finger. The tools were rapidly circling above the man's finger. When Nick saw that, his jaw nearly hit the floor and his eyes shone. "You're a Zephyx extractor?" he asked in shock. The man chuckled. "In the past," he said as the tools vanished again. "Nowadays, I am just a researcher." Nick still looked with wonder at the man. "A Zephyx extractor." Nick gulped. "Okay," he slowly said. "So, what do you have to sell?" The man snorted in amusement. "I'm not here to sell anything. I'm here because my friend at Ghosty's lab contacted me. They don't know what kind of power you've attained or from which specter it comes. My friend knows that I am interested in these things, which was why he told me about you." Nick became nervous when he heard that. That sounded like some evil experimentation stuff. When the man saw Nick's apprehensive expression, he nearly groaned. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man half shouted with annoyance. "I'm just here to look at how your powers work. I will even refer you to some Zephyx manufacturers if your power proves to be useful. This is a good thing for you." Nick was taken aback, but his expression quickly morphed into one of skepticism. "Help? A good thing? In the dregs? Not even children would believe that. And what do you want in exchange?" Nick asked. "In exchange?" the man repeated. "Do you even have anything that can interest me?" Nick struggled to think of something. "Nothing in this world is free," Nick said with suspicion. "Something advertised as free will very quickly turn into something that's not free after some time." The man's expression turned deadpan. "Oh my fucking God," he said in exasperation. Suddenly, the man appeared in front of Nick. Bang! The man hit Nick's head, and Nick fell to the side, unconscious. "Is it so hard to accept that someone just wants to help you?" Silence. The man took another deep breath and sighed. Shing. The bloody tools from earlier appeared in front of him. "Now, let's see what kind of power you have." Chapter 2. A young man walked through the streets of a lively but dirty city. At this moment, it was 2 a.m., but the sun was still shining. It was always shining. There was not a single moment where it wasn't shining. This was how it had been for thousands of years and how it would continue to be for thousands more years. The sun was directly in the middle of the sky, seemingly perfectly above the walking young man. Surprisingly, even though the sun was in the middle of the sky, its light wasn't very bright and overwhelming but subdued and more orange-yellowish in color for the citizens of Crimson Fungus City. It was currently nighttime, although when one talked about night, they were referring to the time between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. This had nothing to do with the state or location of the sun, since that was always static. Most people slept during the nighttime. No one really knew why. But most people followed that social norm since their parents, grandparents, and everyone else had done the same. Some crazy people said that people slept during the night because somehow the sun used to do something called setting in the past. Naturally, that was idiotic. How fast would the sun need to move to go around the earth? How would it even move? It made no sense. As the young man continued walking, he saw several dirty, grimy, and rusty pipes coming out of the ground, which then slithered up the damaged and dirty walls of buildings. The floor of the city was uneven, with half of it made of craggy rock and the other half made of rusty grates that led deep underground. The smell of gas and oil blanketed the streets, but the people living here had already gotten used to it. Crack! Suddenly, one of the grates below the young man's legs broke, and the young man began to fall. However, the young man just reflexively spread his arms and grabbed the grates to his side, stopping his fall. The young man took a deep breath and released it before he pulled himself up. After pulling himself up, he looked around the street for something. He saw a couple of thin people that were sitting at the side of the road, talking with each other. Since it was nighttime, not many people were here. "Hey, do you know where I can get a big sheet of metal?" The young man, Nick, asked the group. It had been 2 years since Nick had met the scholar, and Nick was now 16 years old. The scholar had told Nick about his power, and he even taught him a couple of things over the next couple of days. Right now, Nick was about 180 centimeters tall, which was enormous for someone living in the dregs. The available food was horrible, which made it difficult for people to grow tall. Nick's body was also still quite muscular, giving him quite an intimidating appearance. The group collectively furrowed their brows as they looked at him. Nick's bulky figure intimidated them a bit. "What do you want?" An older lady among them said with a tone of threat in her voice. "I just told you what I want," Nick said as he scratched the side of his head. "I just want a sheet of metal." "Why?" the older lady asked with annoyance. Nick just pointed at the hole in the grates with his thumb. The group just threw a couple of glances at each other. "You want to repair the hole?" the older lady asked with skepticism. Nick nodded. "I'm strong enough to stop my fall and pull myself out. Others aren't," he answered. The lady's expression became even more skeptical. "And you care about that?" Nick just scratched the back of his head. "I mean, I broke it. I should also fix it," he said with a shrug. The group looked at each other again. Then, the older lady pointed at one of the houses at the edge of the street. The house was basically a ruin. A third of it was already missing, and all the metal of the house had already rusted. The city had an overabundance of metal, and all the metal that the wealthy parts of the city didn't need anymore ended up in the dregs. This was also why nearly all houses here were made of rusty metal. "The occupant of it said it 2 days ago?" the older lady said, her voice neutral. Nick nodded. He knew what it meant to say it. It basically meant that the person had committed suicide via a specific method. "Thanks," Nick said as he walked over to the derelict house. After a bit of searching, Nick saw a 2-meter wide and long plate of metal and began to pull. Sadly, the builder of the house seemed to have had a phobia of his house collapsing, which was why he welded everything together. Nick tried for a while, but the metal plate only shuddered and made creaking noises. Nick just sighed and looked around. Then, he walked into the house, away from all prying eyes. Bang! A dent appeared in the metal plate. Bang! 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 After 4 hits, the metal plate broke away from the house and fell to the ground outside as Nick exited through the new hole. The eyes of the earlier group widened in shock. They knew that this young man was strong based on his stature, but wasn't this a bit too much? How much power would one need to dent such a big metal plate? Sure, it wasn't super thick, but this was still metal. Nick pulled the metal plate across the street with quite some difficulties, confusing the group even more. The guy had just dented the plate, but now he had issues carrying it. This made no sense. A couple of seconds later, Nick put the plate over the hole in the grate that he had created earlier and rubbed the sweat off his forehead. He walked on top of the plate and jumped a bit. The metal was creaking, but it didn't move. If the metal could withstand Nick jumping on it, no one would have issues walking over it. Nick nodded with satisfaction and continued walking through the streets. He waved a bit at the group as he left. "Oh, now I know who that is," one of the younger people in the group shouted a couple of seconds later. The others looked at him. "You know him?" The younger guy nodded. "He's that weird guy at the marketplace." "The weird guy?" Another person from the group repeated with uncertainty. "Oh, you mean the one that just sits there with a sign all day?" "Yes, that guy," the other guy said with a nod. "I didn't recognize him since he looks much smaller when he's sitting." The other people raised their eyebrows in understanding. Some of them looked at the derelict house again with newfound realization. That explained how he was strong enough to break the metal. "This means he has an attuned Zephix synchronizer, right?" The others just nodded. "According to his sign, yes." The older lady in the group looked at the sheet of metal in the middle of the street. "You know, if others actually followed his example and fixed what they broke, the dregs wouldn't be nearly as bad," she commented. Nick continued walking down the street, and a couple of minutes later, he arrived at a big plaza. In comparison to the streets, the plaza was mostly made of stone, and the walls weren't too dirty. Nick could see a couple of merchants stationed around their wagons filled with wares. Since it was night, only the poorest and the richest merchants sold their wares. The poorest sold their wares at night since there was far less competition. And the richest did the same since they could just hire someone to keep their shop open all the time. The other 80 of shops were only open between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Nick walked across the plaza until he arrived at the widest road in the dregs. The road led to one of the exits of Crimson Fungus City. At the spot where the road and the plaza met, Nick stopped and walked to the side after sitting down. Nick pulled out a roll of cardboard and unrolled it before putting it on a metal rod he had brought with him. Lastly, Nick just lifted his new sign and waited. Zephix extractor looking for work. And then he waited. Chapter 3. People slowly woke up and exited from their derelict houses. It was early in the morning, but just like always, the sun was high up in the sky, illuminating the streets. Nick was still holding his sign as he watched the people with boredom. Over 50 of the people were malnourished, and the remainder could still be called skinny. Only the richest merchants had some visible fat on their bellies. Even though the sun was shining all day, nearly everyone had pale skin, and a couple of them even had black rings around their eyes as they slowly walked through the streets. As Nick saw the people, he could tell that most of them were very fidgety and anxious. Nick knew that this day would be the most dangerous day of the month since people became desperate. Today was the worst day of the month. The day everyone dreaded. Nevertheless, Nick continued holding up his sign as he waited. Albert, Nick's mentor, told him he would soon find work as a Zephix extractor in the dregs. He only needed to be visible. Albert was the powerful Zephix extractor that Nick had met 2 years ago. After Nick had woken up from Albert's slap, the two of them had gotten to know each other. Due to the circumstances of how Nick had gained his mysterious power, Albert decided to mentor Nick for a couple of months since he saw a lot of potential in him. Albert had left around a year ago, and he told Nick that he just needed to remain visible to find work. Apparently, someone would soon appear that would be interested in finding Zephix extractors. This was why Nick was sitting in the marketplace with his sign. Even though everyone dreaded today, to Nick, this was just like any other day. Many people passed by Nick, and he also noticed that nearly everyone was throwing evaluating glances at him. However, no one actually did anything to him. Many people were scared and looked around nervously, but others seemed calm and relaxed. All of the calm ones had small pins on their chest in the image of 2 cross spears. These pins represented the insurance gang, one of the most powerful gangs that were running the dregs from the underground. The people wearing these pins were not gang members but normal citizens that had paid the insurance gang to deal with all the matters today. Bang. Suddenly, a man with blonde hair got punched, and a group of 3 men jumped the guy that got punched. The man curled into a shrimp and held tightly onto something. The 3 attackers continued wailing at the helpless man, but they were careful not to break any bones. "Hand over your credits?" one of them shouted. The blonde man on the ground didn't answer and kept holding onto his credits. The 3 gritted their teeth. Killing someone was forbidden, and they were also not allowed to shed any blood. However, the city wouldn't bat an eye if they broke some bones. But despite how things looked, the 3 men were not psychopaths that wanted the guy to die. If they stole his credits and broke the blonde man's bones, they would essentially kill him in the long run. One of the men grabbed the blonde guy's hair and pulled back with all his power, but the man on the ground didn't let go of his wealth. Even when his blonde hair was torn out, he didn't let go. 2 of the attackers looked at their last friend with frustrated and angry expressions. The last one took a deep breath and took hold of his victim's head. Bang! He shoved the man's head into the pavement, and he lost consciousness. Surprisingly, there was no blood, and the blonde man was still alive. This had been insanely risky. If anything went wrong, the attacking man would be killed by the city for killing another person or wasting valuable blood. A different guy bent down and wrestled a small stack of paper notes out of the blond man's hands. After counting the paper notes, he looked at his two friends and nodded. Then he handed all the notes to one of his friends, who broke into tears. The crying man hugged his two friends and bowed several times in gratitude in front of them. His two friends only assured him that it was fine. The crying man quickly ran away from the middle of the marketplace and into the arms of a woman by the side. The woman was also crying a lot. A moment later, the man let go and kneeled down as he beckoned forward. Two young girls, not older than 8, came out from behind the woman and hugged the man. "I have enough for you," the man said with a quivering voice. Only a couple of people were watching the event. Most people were used to seeing something like this and didn't care. All the people in the marketplace just walked around the unconscious man lying in the middle of the street, treating him like just another piece of rubble. Nick had watched what had happened, but he didn't get involved. What was the point? There wasn't enough money to go around, and it was the duty of everyone to protect themselves. As more time passed, more assaults happened, but Nick just waited, and then it was time. Everything calmed down at about 2 p.m. and the people became very quiet. By now, the entire marketplace was filled to the brim with people. No one was buying or selling anything at this moment. They all were waiting for the same thing. 2 minutes later, the sound of a gigantic swarm of insects came from one of the streets leading to the marketplace, and the sound became louder with time. Eventually, 5 people appeared in one of the streets, and they were accompanied by swarms of huge mosquitoes. The 5 people wore red uniforms with the symbol of Crimson Fungus City on them, showing their identities as people working for the city itself. Each of them carried a couple of big sacks with them, and they wore black gas masks, keeping their identities anonymous. As the 5 city agents walked down the streets, several mosquitoes split off and entered the houses they passed. They were searching for people that were trying to hide. After a while, the mosquitoes came out of the house again and returned to the 5 people as other mosquitoes entered other houses. Suddenly, an entire swarm of mosquitoes charged into one of the houses. A terrifying scream came out of the house, but it rapidly became quieter until it vanished. The swarm of mosquitoes came out of the house a couple of seconds later, and some of them flew into the sky and retreated, but just a couple of seconds later, new mosquitoes replaced the ones that had just left. After around 5 minutes, the 5 people arrived at the entrance of the marketplace. The 5 people didn't say anything for a while. Chapter 4. A bit later, 3 people walked out of the crowd. All 3 of them were tall men with muscular bodies, and they were all wearing the same uniform. It looked like a military uniform painted in black with gray sleeves. This was the uniform of the insurance gang. "Welcome," the leader of the insurance gang said with a polite smile. One of the 5 city agents just extended a hand like they were asking for something. "Of course," the leader said. A moment later, he took out a suitcase, opened it, and handed it to the man. Inside the suitcase were stacks upon stacks of credits in paper form. The city agent counted the money, which took several minutes. "474, he spoke with a distorted voice. When the leader of the insurance gang heard that, he became nervous and his smile seemed more strained. "Excuse me, but it should be 482, he said. "Could you recount, please?" "474, the city agent repeated. Silence. The leader of the insurance gang looked at the person to the right of him and gestured with his head. The guy quickly took out a couple more bills and handed them over. The city agent counted them and nodded. "482. The leader of the insurance gang also nodded. A moment later, the 3 people walked to the side, one by one. "Come forward, you better not try to cheat us," the leader of the insurance gang shouted. A moment later, all the people with the black pins walked forward and passed by the 3 men from the insurance gang. The insurance gang inspected all of them and collected the black pins from everyone that passed by. By the end, 479 people had walked past them. Then, the 3 people from the insurance gang followed them, making the total 482. After that, 4 of the 5 city agents walked towards the less crowded marketplace and commanded everyone to come forward one by one. The last of them waited in the back, making sure that no one was trying to sneak by them. Next, all the people in the marketplace walked forward, handing over a stack of credits each. Nick stood up and passed through the crowd. A moment later, he stood in front of one of the people with the gas masks. Nick handed over a stack of bills and walked past them. Just like any other person in the marketplace, after several minutes, only around 800 people were left in the marketplace. When no one else stepped forward for several seconds, the 5th city agent stepped forward. "Last call," they shouted with a distorted voice. "Anyone not coming forward now will be considered as not able to pay." No one moved. "All right," the man shouted. "As always, do not make any sudden movements and don't show any aggression. The mosquitoes are all minions of the blood mosquito specter, and they will not drink more than what you owe." The crowd of people became scared and nervous. A moment later, the buzzing of the mosquitoes intensified and they flew forward. The mosquitoes scattered across the crowd and started to suck the blood of the people as time passed. Mosquitoes that had filled up flew away as new ones joined. People were crying, hyperventilating, gritting their teeth, and praying. Others had already grown used to it. After around 2 minutes, all the mosquitoes flew back to the 5 people in gas masks. The crowd of people had all become noticeably thinner and whiter. Lastly, the mosquitoes entered all the houses in the marketplace to make sure that no one was trying to hide. And finally, the 5 people turned around and left the marketplace behind as they walked down another street. It was over. This happened every month on the last day. Once a month, every citizen of Crimson Fungus City had to pay 100 credits to the city as tax. One could only pay the tax in full or not at all. Partial payments were not permitted. If one paid the tax, nothing would happen, but if one failed to pay the tax, they would need to pay with their blood. A group of people accompanied by large swarms of sizable mosquitoes walked through the dregs once a month. And if a citizen wasn't able to pay the tax, the swarm of mosquitoes would fall onto the citizen. The swarm of mosquitoes would gather blood until a collective 2 liters had been gathered from adults. Children below the age of 14 only needed to pay 50 credits or 1 liter of blood. Children below the age of 6 didn't need to pay taxes. Naturally, losing 2 liters of blood wasn't lethal, and the mosquitoes were excellent at not inflicting injuries on the people while gathering blood. However, recovering from something like that usually took 6 to 8 weeks, so if a citizen didn't manage to pay the tax next month as well, things would become dangerous. Getting 100 credits in 1 month was nearly impossible for normal people living in the dregs, but getting 100 credits over 2 months was manageable. Because of that, around 50 of people paid blood 1 month, credits the next, and then blood again. Of course, countless people had tried to fight their way out of paying taxes. But it always ended the same way, with the person turning into a bloodless corpse. In fact, the mosquitoes weren't accompanying the tax collectors, but the tax collectors were accompanying the mosquitoes. The tax collectors only came for 2 reasons. They dealt with the money and they stopped people from panicking in front of the mosquitoes. If the mosquitoes wanted, they could kill every living person in the dregs in less than 10 minutes. One had to know that there were over 2,000 people living in the dregs. It wasn't that the mosquitoes were very powerful, but that there were literally millions of them, and every mosquito was bigger than a giant hornet. Naturally, not all of the mosquitoes accompanied the tax collectors. There were only around 100 following each tax collector, but if things became serious, millions of them would appear. Even more, the mosquitoes were the minions of a very powerful specter. The blood mosquito, the rat Nick had talked to 2 years ago, was also a minion of a very powerful specter called the parasite. Some specters could control animals or create their own animals and control them. Their minions would share the perception of the specter, and the specter could also talk and act through the minions. While nearly all specters were the enemies of humanity, there were some specters that cooperated and helped humanity. The blood mosquito was one of them. The parasite was not. The blood mosquito gained power by consuming human blood. Naturally, it could send some isolated mosquitoes to gather blood from sleeping people, but if it overdid things, the truly powerful Zephyx manufacturers would notice it and kill it. So, the blood mosquito had decided to help humanity instead, and Crimson Fungus City was the perfect place. Crimson Fungus City was named after the strongest specter that was being confined inside the most prestigious Zephyx manufacturer. The Crimson Fungus, in contrast to nearly all powerful specters, the Crimson Fungus was not intelligent. As the name implied, the Crimson Fungus was just a huge fungus living inside a containment unit, just like the blood mosquito. The Crimson Fungus gained power by absorbing human blood, but in return, the Crimson Fungus was creating electricity and, most importantly, Zephyx. Zephyx could be used for basically everything. It could be transformed into electricity, heat, movement, and so on, and it was extremely efficient at it. Even more, Zephyx could also be used to increase the powers of Zephyx extractors, and it could also be used to create powerful weapons that could deal with specters. The Crimson Fungus was the reason why the blood mosquito had chosen this city. The blood mosquito would help the Zephyx manufacturer in collecting the blood, and it would get to keep some of the blood in exchange. The remaining blood would be sprinkled onto the Crimson Fungus, which would then produce Zephyx. The Zephyx extractors would collect the Zephyx, and they would be allowed to keep a bit of it as payment. The Zephyx manufacturer would then use the harvested Zephyx to increase the power of their company or sell it to other cities. But if the Zephyx manufacturer wanted to get bigger and earn even more money, they needed even stronger specters, and to get these even stronger specters, they needed stronger Zephyx extractors. This was what Nick wanted to become. Being a Zephyx extractor meant being able to become powerful and having a better life. Nick wanted to get out of the dregs and finally live a better life. Chapter 5. After the tax collectors left, things returned to normal in the marketplace. The anxiety of most people had been replaced with either relief or acceptance. Sadly, even though many people lost 2 liters of blood today, they couldn't go home and rest. They needed to work and earn money, otherwise, they would need to pay with their blood again in a month. Nick returned to his usual place and continued holding up his sign. Nick trusted Albert, and he was sure that Albert wouldn't have told him to make himself noticeable if there were no point to it. Sadly, no one of note talked to Nick, and he had to go home after a while since he was getting hungry by now. Nick was no longer living in a small cube made of metal but in an actual house which was also made of rusty metal. One of the richer people died recently and his house had become available. Well, available might not be the correct word. The man died. And his son was actually now the owner of the house. The problem was that the son was only 11 years old. Naturally, the gangs wanted to take the house from the kid, but Nick went between the two sides and protected the kid. Nick would protect the kid and his inheritance, but in exchange, Nick was allowed to use their money to eat and pay his tax. Of course, the kid didn't have any other choice and accepted. After a couple of fights, the gangs decided that it wasn't worth the trouble. If Nick were just a normal guy, they would just send in like 10 guys to beat him up, but Nick actually had an active Zephyx synchronizer. No one was heavily injured or dead yet, but if they escalated things might change. Quickly, they were certain they could take Nick down, but they were not willing to pay the price. The house wasn't worth enough since it was just a bit above average. Also, the kid had a claim on it, and the gangs couldn't get too overbearing. Smart, organized criminals knew that leading a flock of willing and happy sheep was easier than leading a flock of terrified sheep. That was also why the leader of the insurance gang had been willing to pay the difference in the taxes out of pocket. Some of his people had obviously siphoned some funds out of the collected taxes, and they would hold an internal investigation if the leader had decided to simply hand over the 8 people with the missing cash. His insurance gang wouldn't be as trustworthy anymore, and next month they might only get like 70 of their previous customers. The insurance gang asked for 10 of the taxes as a protection and processing fee, which meant that adults would pay them 10 credits to protect their 100 credits. With about 480 customers, that came to 4,800 credits. Even when the leader paid 800 credits out of pocket, they still made a profit of 4,000 credits. If he had refused to hand over the 800 credits, they would have saved 800 credits today, but they might pay 1,500 credits in lost profits for every following month for a long time. Even though they were criminals and this was the dregs, it was still important that people were satisfied with the services provided, and waging war against someone that was protecting a vulnerable child was bad. It wasn't worth it. Of course, everything had its advantages and disadvantages. While Nick got a nice home and had no money problems anymore, he had permanently destroyed any opportunity to work for any of the gangs. For 2 weeks, Nick kept going to the marketplace to wait with his sign raised. One particular day that didn't seem different from any other, someone approached Nick in the marketplace. It was a young but tall man with light brown hair. His hair was chaotic, but it was clean. His brown shirt and trousers were torn but just as clean as someone that had lived in the dregs for his entire life. Nick could immediately tell that the guy in front of him was trying to act poor when he obviously wasn't. The guy probably hadn't even seen a poor person up to today, otherwise his disguise wouldn't be so superficial. The man walked up to Nick with a friendly smile, but Nick could see that the guy was very nervous deep inside. "Hey, you're a Zephyx extractor?" the man asked as he looked at Nick's sign. "I got through the entrance exam for Ghosty's lab, but I never worked as one since my Zephyx synchronizer is already attuned," Nick answered as he looked with suspicion at the guy. A small glimmer appeared in the guy's eyes when he heard that. "Your Zephyx synchronizer is already attuned." Nick nodded. Silence. The guy seemed uncertain about how to proceed with the conversation, and Nick could practically read his thoughts with how expressive his face was. Nick was quite certain that the guy was trying to find a way to get Nick to tell him more about himself without seeming like a shady person that wanted to scam him. "You know Albert?" Nick asked. The guy's eyes widened for just an instant before he smiled uncomfortably. "There are many people called Albert," he said awkwardly. "Bullshit," Nick thought. "Nobody here is called Albert except for that one guy. Black and gray hair, and he summoned a couple of things that can hover. Maybe you can fill out the last detail to make sure that we are talking about the same person," Nick said with a suspicious expression. The man blinked a couple of times. "He is fond of tools," the man added after a while. When Nick heard that, he smiled brightly. "Finally," he said as he stood up, making the man move backward. Albert told me that someone would come with a job in the near future. I guess you're the guy? The man also became excited. Apparently, he had also expected to meet someone. But then, his expression fell and he became suspicious. I know him, but I don't think I have the capital to hire you. I also live in the dregs, he said carefully. At that moment, the surrounding people threw incredulous looks at him as they stopped walking. The man noticed, and he felt like he had said something wrong. Dude, Nick said, making the man turn to him. You just said capital, also your disguise is horrible. Nobody will believe you. If they did, they would have already shaken you down for everything you have, based on how uncertain and fearful you look. The man's smile turned more uncomfortable. I'm not sure, Dash. Come with me? Nick said as he grabbed the guy's arm to pull him away. The guy looked with shock at the place where Nick was grabbing him, and for just an instant, his eyes turned pure white. But he quickly calmed down again, and his eyes turned back to normal instantaneously. He had never seen anyone that just grabbed a stranger and pulled them away. Hey, I can walk on my own, the guy said as he pulled his arm out of Nick's grip. Then come, Nick said, gesturing with his head to the distance. The man took out a handkerchief and cleaned the spot where Nick had touched him and followed after him. After a couple of minutes, they arrived in front of Nick's temporary home. The man became a bit uncertain again, but he just took a deep breath and entered. Chapter 6. When the man entered the house, he became more uncomfortable. There was dirt everywhere, and there were even several holes in the walls. If he became careless, he might even cut himself on the sharp edges of the walls. Hey, come over! Nick shouted from one of the rooms. The man walked over and saw Nick sitting on the ground in the middle of a bigger room. There were no tables or chairs. Then, he just looked at the place in front of Nick with a questioning gaze. Should I sit down? Well, duh, Nick answered with a roll of his eyes. The man took a deep breath and sat down. Do you have anything to drink? He asked. The water barrel is in the back. Nick gestured to his back. Oh, okay. The man said, do you have a glass or a mug? Nick blinked slowly. A what? He asked. You know, a mug, he repeated, gesturing with his hands. A small container for liquids. Nick blinked slowly again. Why? Just drink, he said with a deadpan expression and voice. The man looked with an uncomfortable expression at Nick. Never mind. I'm not thirsty, he said. Silence? I'm Winter, the man said, stretching his hand forward for a handshake. Nick looked at the hand. What do you want? He asked, looking at it. A handshake and an introduction? Winter asked awkwardly, keeping his arm outstretched. Nick furrowed his brows and moved his own hand forward. Then, Nick grabbed Winter's fingers and looked him in the eyes. I'm Nick. Winter smiled uncomfortably and moved his hand up and down for a handshake, while Nick looked back at the shaking hands. Could you please let go? Winter asked. Nick frowned, confused why Winter wanted them to hold hands and then suddenly not, but he still let go of Winter's fingers. Sorry, Nick. I still need to get used to how people down here act, Winter said with an apologetic expression. Sure enough, he isn't from here. Nick thought. The fact that Winter had said, down here meant that he came from the inner city. Crimson Fungus City was comprised of two parts, the inner city and the outer city. If one were to look at Crimson Fungus City from a plane, one would see a huge city, which surrounded an absolutely enormous structure in the middle of it. The structure was a humongous curvy pyramid in the shape of a hyperbola. It was made of reflective metal and was nearly 2 kilometers high and 5 kilometers wide. Around this huge structure were many tall and expensive buildings, but the further one got away from the center, the smaller and uglier the buildings got. About 3 kilometers away from the edge of the structure was the dregs, the outermost part of the city. In the dregs were the poorest people who could barely survive. Between the dregs and the inner city was the actual outer city. Ghosty's lab was in the inner city, but the location for the exam had been in the outer city. Nick had heard legends about the inner city, but he had never been there, and he had only met 2 people that had been there, Albert and Winter. You're from the inner city, right? Nick asked. Yes, but from the lower levels, Winter answered. It's my first time in the dregs. I can tell, Nick said as Winter only smiled uncomfortably. So, why are you here? Nick asked. Before I tell you, I need you to sign something, Winter said as he took some sheets of paper from a small sack hanging from his belt. Nick looked at the first sheet of paper and furrowed his brows. No non-disclosure agreement? Non-disclosure agreement? What's that? Nick asked. Winter looked with shock at Nick. You can't read. Nick furrowed his brows. I can read. I learned it from Albert. I'm just out of practice. Okay. Winter answered quickly. That's a non-disclosure agreement. It means that you are not allowed to talk about any of the things I'm about to tell you to anyone else, or the city will come for you. Essentially, if you talk about my secrets, you will be a criminal. Okay, Nick said absent-mindedly as he tried to read the first sentence of the NDA, but it was far beyond difficult. Reading and understanding a legal document was already difficult for adults with a lot of money. And Nick's reading comprehension was on the level of an elementary school student. After a couple of minutes, Winter offered to just read out everything for Nick, but Nick said he didn't trust him and that he would read it himself. 2 hours and many questions about what words meant. Later, Nick had finally finished reading everything. After some more instructions from Winter, Nick awkwardly signed the bottom of the page. Nick was so confused about all of this. He knew what he had signed, but it was still so alien and strange. Okay. Winter said with a relieved sigh, everything we talk about from now on is subject to the NDA, which means you are not allowed to tell the contents to a third person without my consent. Do you understand? Nick nodded. My full name is Winter Melfian, and I am the third heir to the Melfian family, Winter said. Nick blinked a couple of times. Silence. Okay, Nick commented. Winter took a deep breath. He had never gotten such a dismissive reaction to the revelation of his family name. My father is on the board of directors of Kugelblitz, Winter added. Nick blinked once slowly. Okay, he said. Winter ruffled his hair in frustration. He partially runs the city. Winter shouted. Kugelblitz is the Zephyx manufacturer that has the crimson fungus, and my father owns 20 of Kugelblitz. Oh, Nick said in surprise. That's cool, I guess. Winter massaged the bridge of his nose in annoyance and sighed. It's not important anyway, he said. What's important is that my father doesn't want his heirs to grow up to be useless good-for-nothings. He worked hard to get where he is now. And he wants us to do the same thing. Because of that, he instructed all of his children to build a Zephyx manufacturer company and earn enough to buy 0.05 of Kugelblitz. Otherwise, we don't get to use our family's resources, Winter explained. 0.05? Nick asked, how much is that? Like 1,000 credits? Winter snorted, more like 50 million. Nick's eyes shot open in shock. 50 million credits. Wait, and Winter's father owned 20 of that company. How much money was that? Winter smirked when he saw that Nick was finally surprised by his background. Anyway, he said, in comparison to my siblings, I refused to get taken advantage of by the Zephyx manufacturers in the inner city and came out here where there's basically zero competition. I need a Zephyx extractor to get my business off the ground, and since I don't have a Spectre, I can't just recruit normal people. I need someone that already has an attuned Zephyx synchronizer. Albert told me that I would find someone meeting my criteria in the central marketplace of the dregs. And that's why we are here now. By now, Winter's anxiety and uncertainty in his demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by a competent, direct, and charismatic businessman. I want to employ you as my chief Zephyx extractor. And the first thing we need is to capture a Spectre. Chapter 7. I'm in. Nick immediately answered. Winter was a bit taken aback. That was quick, he said with a couple of blinks. Don't you want to know anything about your job? Salary? Duties? Is it worse than my current situation? Nick asked. Winter glanced around the broken and dirty home. Even though this was one of the bigger houses in the dregs, it was still in horrendous condition. The chances of death are rather high, Winter commented. After all, you have to interact with specters. Nick nodded. So, I gotta beat some specters up. No big deal. Winter furrowed his brows in skepticism. Do you even know what a specter is? Powerful animals or humans with some abilities, right? Nick asked casually. As long as I can punch them, they can die, right? Winter took a deep breath and sighed. That's true for some of them, but that is not the majority, he answered. Do you know what Zephyx is? Stuff we get from specters, Nick answered with a confident nod. Yes, but what is it? Winter asked with another sigh. Silence. Energy. Nick asked with uncertainty. Winter just snorted. That's a cop-out answer. You can say everything is energy, and you wouldn't be wrong. Have you ever heard of prefix? Prefix? The stuff you put before words. Nick asked. No, prefix, spelled PRPHYX, not PREFIX. It's like Zephyx but with pre instead of Z dash dot. Nick shook his head. All right, Winter said with a bit of annoyance. Let me just give you a quick rundown of how the world actually works. Nick nodded and listened to Winter. Prefix is an invisible force of energy that exists all over the world. It can only be detected by very advanced equipment and by very powerful extractors. Prefix has an incredible amount of energy stored inside of it. Sadly, we can't access the prefix in the atmosphere. We simply don't have any means to actually make use of the energy stored inside the prefix. When the prefix in the atmosphere gains a certain level of density, it can create a specter. A specter is something that can transform prefix into suffix, which is a usable form of prefix. A specter is not necessarily alive, and it is not necessarily intelligent. Additionally, specters are unique, which means that there is only one specter of any kind in the world. There are never two or more specters that are identical in general. Specters appear in one of three different forms, but there can be exceptions. 1. A force specter. A force specter can be an intelligent or non-intelligent being that consists of forms of energy. For example, the specter we call the fog is a formless cloud of something that mimics fog. It is unintelligent and only follows its basic instinct. From time to time, it wanders through some parts of the city and engulfs someone. That person will then wander aimlessly in the fog until they die of starvation. You can't feel the fog, you can't punch the fog, you can't run out of the fog. If it catches you, you will die unless you are a strong suffix extractor that has equipment and abilities based on suffix. Is the fog still around? Nick asked. Winter laughed bitterly. Have you forgotten what I said earlier? When prefix reaches a certain density, a specter can appear. Something like the fog is extremely difficult to contain. Additionally, it only consumes about one human every month. The fog is a level 2 specter, which makes it stronger than the most common specters, but it only consumes one human every month. Now, if we were to kill it, its energy would disperse into the atmosphere again, and we would quickly find a couple more level 1 specters in the world, and chances are that they will cost more human lives than the fog. Wait! Nick shouted, but can't we just store all the suffix of the fog after killing it? Surprisingly, Winter nodded. We can. But it doesn't change anything. What? Nick asked in surprise. Winter nodded again. Naturally, when we kill a specter, we store all their energy, but it doesn't change anything. If we ignore all the energy and let it disperse, a couple of level 1 specters will appear. If we store all the energy and don't let it disperse, a couple of level 1 specters will still appear. No matter what we do, killing a specter will always result in the creation of more, weaker specters. Nick looked at the ground with a worried expression. That was troublesome. This meant that they couldn't possibly get rid of the specters. Winter noticed Nick's crestfallen expression. It's not as hopeless as you think. Nick looked at Winter. Humanity's ultimate plan for survival is to contain every single specter in the world without killing them. If we can do that, all the specters would essentially become irrelevant since they wouldn't be a danger anymore. Winter explained. Nick furrowed his brows again. That sounds difficult. There are probably a lot of specters. Oh, the numbers aren't the problem, Winter said casually. You have no idea how powerful extractors can become. The issue isn't the number, but the power of the specters. Please remember that everything we are talking about is subject to the NDA. If you tell anyone else about it, your life will essentially be forfeit. Nick nodded. Winter nodded back. Specters are categorized into different levels of power. Every new specter starts at level 1. This makes them more powerful than every normal human, but people with an attuned suffix synchronizer can fight them. Specters and extractors can both become more powerful. The strongest suffix extractors that exist are level 8, and we have a single-digit number of them. However, there is a 2-digit number of level 8 specters in the world. Nick looked with shock at Winter, and then Nick remembered something he had witnessed several times by now. What about Nurse Alice? He asked. Everyone knew about Nurse Alice. Everyone in the dregs had seen Nurse Alice, and everyone knew that Nurse Alice was a specter. Winter sighed. Nurse Alice is one of the 5 level 9 specters. Nick took a deep breath. There are exactly 5 level 9 specters in the world, and even if all of humanity banded together, we wouldn't be able to stop even a single one of them. Nurse Alice is probably the most damaging specter in the entire world. She kills hundreds and sometimes even thousands of humans every single day. But her power is so great that nobody can do anything against her. She does whatever she wants, and we can do nothing but watch. And there are 4 more like her. Chapter 8. Nick thought back to the last time he had seen Nurse Alice. It was a bit more than 2 months ago. The people had gathered in the marketplace to pay their blood tax, and a man had just stolen all the credits of a frail young woman. It had been quite obvious that she had already paid with her blood for the last or even the last 2 times. After she had lost her credits, she just looked at the ground with a dead expression, and then she had uttered the sentence, "I wish I were dead." At that moment, the marketplace fell silent. Everyone knew what it meant to say the sentence. A minute later, a girl with a bright and kind smile walked into the marketplace. She looked like she was in her late teens, and she wore a clean pink nurse's outfit. No one dared to stand in her way, and even though the marketplace was filled to the brim, the people still managed to make a wide road for the kindly smiling nurse. The nurse walked over to the woman who was still kneeling in the middle of the marketplace. The woman looked up when the nurse stopped in front of her. The nurse just kindly smiled at her. I'm Nurse Alice and I'm here because you called me, she said with a kind and empathetic tone. Just calm down, it will be over soon. And you won't feel any pain or discomfort. The woman looked at the ground again. A moment later, Nurse Alice kneeled down beside her and slowly moved her right palm over the woman's eyes, like someone that was closing the opened eyes of a corpse. When she had closed her eyes, the woman had already died. Nurse Alice gently laid the corpse on the ground and stood up with a kind smile. A moment later, she vanished from the marketplace. If anyone in the world uttered something akin to, "I wish I were dead, I want to die, just kill me, I don't want to live anymore," or anything similar to that, Nurse Alice would appear and grant that wish. It didn't matter whether the person wanted it or not. After uttering the sentence, Nurse Alice would kill them, even if the sentence were said as a joke. It didn't matter if anyone, for any reason, uttered something akin to the sentence. Nurse Alice would arrive and end their life. Have you ever said anything like that in your life? Maybe when a loved one died, maybe when your head was hanging in the toilet after too much drinking, maybe when something really embarrassing happened. The occasion didn't matter. As long as anyone said it, Nurse Alice would arrive. And she's only one of the 5 level 9 specters? Nick asked. Winter nodded. 3 of the level 9 specters are unmissable. I can guarantee you that almost everyone has seen the 3 of them in their life before. Do you know the other 2? Nick quickly nodded. I know one of them. It's the one that resides in the darkness. Correct, Winter said. The nightmare is one of the 5 level 9 specters and it is omnipresent in all the dark places in the world. The darker the place, the stronger its influence. Nick remembered one of the many times he had encountered the nightmare. Nick had once been searching for food, which was why he had walked into the sewers. Luckily, the ceiling of the sewers was mostly made of grates, which meant that the omnipresent sun could also illuminate them. However, there had been some dark corridors in the sewers as well, and whenever Nick walked through them, he heard the whispers. Human voices appeared in the darkness, telling Nick that everyone was trying to kill him and that nobody cared whether he lived or died. The whispers were trying to fill Nick's mind with paranoia, depression, self-doubt, hatred, anger, and every other kind of negative emotion. They wanted to warp Nick into a different person. Luckily, the dark corridors hadn't been that dark and long, which made it possible for him to quickly get through them and find a rat to eat. The existence of the nightmare was also the reason why many newly built houses in the dregs purposefully created several holes in the ceiling and walls. Being in the darkness was extremely dangerous, which was why everyone avoided being in dark places. The nightmare and Nurse Alice were so powerful that it didn't matter where someone was. Their influence extended across the entire world. Do you also know of the third one? Winter asked. Nick thought about the question for a while, but eventually he just shook his head. Surprisingly, Winter said, the third one is the most conspicuous of all. Then, Winter pointed up. Nick looked up and saw that Winter was pointing at a hole in the ceiling, and Nick could see the sun through that hole. It's the sun, Winter said. Nick's eyes widened. The sun? Wait, the sun is a specter. Surprising, right? Winter commented. Nick just nodded. We have managed to somewhat calculate and understand the powers of the other 4 level 9 specters, but when it comes to the sun, we are essentially still blind. It is everywhere all the time. Anyone that flies above a certain height immediately ceases to exist. Everyone sees the sun exactly above them at all times. It doesn't matter on which side of the planet you are. The sun is always at the same spot for everyone individually. And most shocking of all, its light is real. The entire world is illuminated by its light. It has the power to illuminate the entire world at the same time without having to take a break. The sheer amount of energy that requires is incomprehensible. All of humanity agrees that the sun is the most powerful specter that exists in the world, and it is the biggest obstacle standing between humanity and freedom. If humanity ever wants to achieve freedom, there's only a single thing we need to do. Kill the sun. Chapter 9. Nick just looked with shock at Winter. Kill the sun? How? How could a human destroy something as powerful as the sun? What would even happen after it was destroyed? Of course, Winter added, all of that is far in the future, and we might not witness it in our lifetime. Nick looked at the hole in the ceiling again. In the last couple of minutes, the world had become much bigger to him. Until now, Nick had just wanted to get a good job to live a better life, but now he had heard about so many grand things. Humanity was several times weaker than the collective specters. Nick only sighed. Nick had seen horrible things in the dregs, and he wanted to change the world. Surprisingly, Nick's issue wasn't with the gangs or the robbers, but with the system. The people simply did what they could to survive. If there were enough to go around, people might not kill each other as much. Sure, greed would always be present, but it wouldn't be so overwhelming. Sadly, Nick knew that he was just one man. He couldn't change anything. So The next best thing was to live a good life without having to compromise his moral compass. If he had the power to change things, he would, but he didn't, and he most likely never will. After a couple of seconds of silence, Nick sighed. What about the other two? The fourth one is the maw, Winter explained. The maw is not something that the majority of people will ever come into contact with since it exclusively interacts with Zephix extractors. From time to time, it grabs a group of extractors and forces them to fight each other until only a single one survives, who is then allowed to leave. Nick sighed. And there's nothing we can do? Winter just shook his head. What about the last one? Nick asked. Winter looked a bit troubled and furrowed his brows. The last one is difficult to talk about since it is rather special. No one knows what it looks like and no one knows where it is, but the effects of its existence are indisputable. Winter looked up at the sun through the hole. In a way, it's the opposite of the sun. Everyone's attention is fixed on the sun, almost like it is afraid of not being seen by everyone in the world. The fifth level 9 specter is the opposite. It's like it doesn't dare to show itself. No one is allowed to know what it looks, sounds, tastes, smells, or feels like. There have been cases in which some powerful extractors analyzed all the scattered clues of its existence. Winter looked at the ground with a troubled expression. One day, that group died, and all their findings were destroyed along with them. Then, Winter looked at Nick, but interestingly enough, nothing else was damaged, only the things relevant to it had been destroyed. Due to the manner of its existence, we call it null. Null, Nick repeated with a shocked voice. Winter just raised an eyebrow. Why are you so surprised? Specters have strange abilities. Nick looked at the ground. After a bit, he looked at his hands with an unsure expression. I think I understand now, he said. That's why Albert was so interested in me. Winter looked with quite some interest at Nick. Do tell. Nick looked at Winter. I think I've seen Null before. For just an instant, Winter was taken aback, but he quickly became skeptical. If you did, you would be dead. Nick slowly shook his head. I think I have seen it before, but I do not know what it looks, smells, tastes, sounds, or feels like. Winter blinked several times. What? He asked in confusion. I have amnesia, Nick said. I don't remember anything from before I was 10. My earliest memory is waking up in a room in a random house in the dregs. I lived in the house for a couple of days. But some people came in and threw me onto the streets. Winter looked with intensity at Nick. And what makes you believe that you have seen Null? My attuned Zephix synchronizer, Nick said. It has been attuned ever since I remember. Speaking of, Winter said, I need to know what kind of ability you have. Can you show me? Nick laughed helplessly. That's the thing. It's impossible. I can't show you my ability. Winter's expression became skeptical. Then how am I supposed to believe that you even have one? I have one. But I can't show you, Nick said. Explain. Winter said, I can only use my ability when no one can see me. Nick explained, when no one can see me, I can move about 5 times faster, and my body is several times stronger. Winter rubbed his chin in thought. That is a very substantial increase in power. Can you prove your ability in some way? Nick remembered the time he had fixed the hole in the ground by breaking part of a house and nodded. Follow me, Nick said as he walked out of the house. Winter followed Nick, and the two of them stopped beside a ruin of a house. After a bit of testing, Nick found an iron plate that had been bolted onto 2 stable beams. No normal human could get the iron plate off the beams without tools. Wait on the side, Nick said as he walked to the other side. Winter waited with raised eyebrows. BOM. Winter's eyes shot open in shock as he saw a big dent appear on the iron plate. Boom. Another huge dent appeared after an explosive sound. That enough? Nick asked as he walked out from behind the plate. Winter still had difficulties believing Nick. What if Nick had prepared some kind of contraption that he could quickly hide after using it? Winter wanted to test Nick some more, but after several minutes of different kinds of tests, Winter could only accept that what Nick was claiming was the truth. As they returned to the house, Winter thought about Nick's ability, and when they sat down again, Winter had only one question. How can you use that ability against an opponent? As soon as you enter a fight with anyone, you effectively lose all your power. Nick smiled uncomfortably. I have no idea. Chapter 10. Inside the house, the two of them returned to talking. Winter and Nick talked about Nick's duties and the plans of development for their Zephix manufacturing company. Winter also told Nick about the 2 remaining categories of specters since they had gotten sidetracked earlier. The first one was a force specter, which represented a specter in the form of something untouchable. The fog had been used as an example. The second kind of specter was a physical specter, as the name suggested. A physical specter had a physical body. The body could be an animal, a human, a plant, an item, and so on. For example, the crimson fungus was a physical specter. It could be touched and it could be injured by a strong physical force. While something like the fog couldn't be injured by a physical force, even though the fog was vastly inferior to the crimson fungus. Lastly, there were possession specters. These were specters that did not have their own bodies. Instead, they took control over a living or non-living entity. For example, Ghosty's lab had once essentially won the lottery by finding the glasses, which was a possession specter. The glasses was a level 2 specter, and it simply looked like a pair of glasses. If anyone put on the glasses, their reality would slightly warp in very inconspicuous ways. Over a long enough period of time, the wearer would become insane, but that was it. As long as one knew what was going on, it wouldn't be a big issue. And to top it all off, the glasses produced Zephix as long as someone wore them. It didn't endanger anyone, it didn't attempt to escape, it was easy to get Zephix from it. It was the perfect specter for Zephix manufacturers. Naturally, Winter and Nick wanted to get a possession specter for their business, but finding one depended on luck and resources. The two of them wouldn't even be able to do anything against a force specter since they didn't have any Zephix equipment yet. Without equipment made of Zephix, it was impossible to interact with force specters. Even worse, force specters were notorious for being hard to contain since most of them could just pass through walls. Containing a force specter needed a highly advanced containment unit made of many different materials made of Zephix. In the end, they were left with going after a physical specter, but that came with its own challenges. First, even a level 1 specter was something that every Zephix manufacturer wanted, even the really big ones. Specters were very rare, and all the big Zephix manufacturers had people dedicated to finding clues about possible specters. Then, Nick also had to contain them, and lastly, he could only attempt to get a level 1 specter. A level 2 specter was too powerful for a new Zephix extractor like Nick. The rat that had tried to convince Nick to kill himself had once said that Nick had met 2 specters. Yet, Nick hadn't been able to see the specters. To Nick, it had been like he had never seen any specters, which meant that the specters had been either invisible or mixed among the crowd of people. Surprisingly, Nick didn't doubt the rat's words. After all, he knew who the rat was. In fact, everyone knew about the rats. The rats were the minions of a very powerful specter called the parasite. The parasite was located somewhere in the wilderness, and nobody had seen it before. In order to get human corpses, the parasite took control of a huge swarm of rats and sent them into the city. Through its minions, it could interact with and sense the entire city. And when someone was suicidal or depressed, one of the rats would walk out and try to convince that person to kill themselves. While the parasite was very powerful, its rats weren't very powerful, and forcefully attacking someone with a swarm of rats had proven to be very inefficient. Because of that, the parasite tried to convince people to kill themselves without uttering the sentence. Despite everything, Nurse Alice wasn't the biggest fan of having the corpses of her clients defiled, which was why the parasite didn't dare to consume the corpse of someone that had uttered the sentence. Nevertheless, the parasite was very powerful, and it could probably find all kinds of specters in the city. Sadly, it was impossible to work with the parasite otherwise. It would already be working with one of the bigger Zephix manufacturers. Eventually, Winter and Nick ironed out all the details, and their working relationship was set in stone. Winter was the owner, CEO, clerk, recruiter, and administrator of the company. Essentially, he was dealing with everything that wasn't related to interacting with specters. Nick was the chief Zephix extractor, information gatherer, and security officer. In short, Winter was the brains, and Nick was the muscles. Winter also showed Nick the place he had bought for their company in the western edge of the dregs. Just a little bit before the actual city, Winter had bought a big warehouse. In comparison to all the buildings in the dregs, the warehouse actually wasn't made of rusty metal. Instead, it just looked plain inside. The warehouse had been completely emptied except for one thing. In the center of the warehouse was a steel cuboid, 5 by 5 by 3 meters big. This was one of the cheapest containment units available, but it already cost a ridiculous sum to get one. According to Winter, this containment unit had cost him over 200,000 credits. It was made of extremely hard steel, and the walls were over 30 centimeters thick. Nick even wanted to try if he could escape from it, but the walls were so hard that even he was helpless. This kind of cheap containment unit could safely contain a level 1 physical and possession specter, but it wouldn't work against force specters. Even more, level 2 physical specters would have enough power to slowly chip away at the containment unit until it broke. When Nick heard that, he realized how powerful a level 2 specter actually was. A level 2 specter could break through this insanely solid room of metal. Eventually, everything had been prepared. They had a containment unit. They had an administrator. They had a Zephix extractor. Now, they were only missing the last piece, a specter. As Nick walked back onto the streets, he just awkwardly scratched the back of his head. I have no idea where I can find one.